What is up, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. This is the Sinvertek Drive N5 Plus preamp. So from what I could gather from the website is they were really going for basically creating a tube amp overdrive channel in a pedal. And specifically, they really wanted to capture the feel. Now this has a ton of controls on it, so I'm just going to list them off for you. I'm not going to go into depth. You can check out how that sounds in the demo part of this video. So as far as the potentiometers go, you've got a volume control, gain control, bass control, mid, treble, resonance, and presence. And that's pretty typical of what I would see on a modern tube preamp. Now you have a series of switches on this thing. At the very top, you have a gain structure switch, and that's going to allow you to choose between 3 different gain structures. So vintage, modern, and ultra. We'll get into how that sounds in the demo. Right below that, you have a low end switch. And from what I could gather from the website, it tailors how the gain basically goes through the low end, or is affected by the low end. I'm not quite sure. Hopefully I got that right. But when it's in the up position, it's medium. In the center, T stands for tight. And then when it's down, in the down position, it's heavy. Right below that is your top end switch. And it basically covers pick attack and maybe a little bit more. When it's in the down position, or I should say when it's in the center position, it's neutral. When it's down, it's going to add just high end. And then in the up position, which is P1, it's going to add high end and mid. Right below that is your mid-range frequency selector switch, basically. So that's going to allow you to choose the mid frequency and then turn that frequency obviously up and down with the mid control. So when it's in the center position, it's low mid. When it's in the up position, it's basically just your mid. And then when it's in the down position, that's your high mid. Right below that, you have a saturation switch. That's going to control the amount of saturation. So in one mode, it's in the high mode, it's going to have obviously more saturation, and then in the low mode, it'll have less. We'll get into that. And then last but not least is what's called tone intensity. And from what I can gather is those are basically just set I don't want to call them shelves, but just set frequency ranges that you can choose between. One is has more low end, like fat low end, but maybe a little bit less mid. And then the other is more open and it's brighter. And it just depends on the amp you're using and guitar and how you play and what your preferences are. And then obviously below that is your bypass switch. Let's check out the Sinvertek Drive N5 Plus. Okay, this is just the guitar straight into the amp. Pretty straight ahead clean. And here's the N5 Plus. Okay, so where to start? You know what? Let's just start with the gain structure. I just briefly hit it for you, but before I really change anything, let's just check that out. So right now we're in the vintage gain. Still a good amount of gain there. But without changing the gain control like I just did, but I won't again, I'm going to throw it to modern. So there's more gain there. I sense a little bit more low end, but there's also a little bit of a tightness to it too. Whereas in the vintage mode, it's more open, but not quite as tight. Now we'll go to ultra gain. And with that one, I'm inclined to roll the lows off a bit. So there's a ton of gain really on tap without even touching the gain control. Back up to vintage. Modern. So obviously in ultra mode with the gain dimed like that, I mean, it got away from me. I'm sure there's players that could handle that, but it definitely, right there is great. It's a ton of gain. All these gain settings, these structure settings feel really good, by the way. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it in the vintage mode. And without changing EQ, the one thing I found with this pedal is you know, once you did set up your EQ kind of for your bass line, I found that I could get closer to the tones I wanted quicker simply by just changing switches. So this one here is your top end switch, and it's basically pick attack. So right now it's in, I guess, what would be considered neutral. In the up position, or P1, you can hear that it's adding top end and mids. In a track, I really liked that setting. So back to neutral. Now I'll go to the P2 setting, and that one is just adding highs. Go to P1. There's more mid and high there, whereas in the P2 position, just adding top end. You know what, I think, well, I'll go ahead and put it neutral. So that's how I can sculpt the top end without even touching the presence or the treble. Now we'll check out the mid-range. Right now I've got it in the high setting, which would be a higher mid, I guess, frequency that you can change with the mid control. I liked that setting best. You've got a low mid, and then you have a mid-high. And I was kind of torn. I like the mid-high, but in the track, you know, in an ensemble or a recording with other guitars, I liked the high mid just because it would cut. Especially for solos, it might be a little too much if you're playing by yourself, so maybe do the other setting. Kind of to each his own, but once again, lots of sculpting there without changing any of the actual knobs. Okay, now we'll check out the gain saturation. Right now it's in the green mode, so it's going to be less saturation. If I hit the switch up, goes to red, it's going to be more saturated. Now Now there is more saturation, but it also has a bit more of a sag to it, at least to me. And I would say put on some headphones if you really want to hear this. Some of these settings aren't going to translate if you're listening to like laptop speakers or an iPhone. That's the saturation. Now on the bottom here is, it's called tone intensity. And from what I can gather, it's kind of a shelving. This is what they're saying is the standard position. So when it's in yellow like this, to me it's a little darker. It doesn't have quite as much mids. Maybe a little more low end. In the blue mode, it's brighter, a little bit tighter, maybe a little more open. And that's got a lot of bite, but I mean, if you liked it that, open, could roll off some treble and presence then to compensate, but still have that openness. So that's all of the switches. We've covered the gain, the bass control. Gets pretty huge. It just depends on what you're using. Now this resonance frequency. That's not going to translate really unless you're wearing in-ears of some sort, but I do feel it in here. It does what I expected it to do. It's the really kind of pillowy lows. And then of course the presence is exactly what you think it is. Adds that sizzle up top. And then treble does exactly what you think. Here's treble off. Treble all the way up. So it can get pretty bright. Just, well, once again, it depends on what amp you're using, what guitar, how you're playing, but it's a really broad, pretty active treble control. And same thing with the mid control. Right now I'll just leave it in the high setting where I had it. Off. So once again, that's pretty active in the amount of cut, and then of course boost. And I really like that mid frequency. So this pedal is extremely versatile. It does take a second to discover, but once I did, it was really easy to just kind of dial things in. And like I said, I left things alone for the most part because I could just, like this was pretty much like a standard setting for me. And then the rest of it was just throwing switches. If I wanted more gain, I just, hit the modern, had more gain. If it added maybe a little too much low end, I could soften up the bass. If I wanted it to still feel vintage, then I'd go ahead and add more gain and stay in the vintage mode. And I tend to stay there because that's more open, overall. If I needed it to be maybe, a little more saturated, I just hit the sat switch. A little more saturation. So the sky's the limit in how I could dial it and get sounds out of it quickly, just literally by throwing the switches. So that is the Sinvertek. And as always, I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you next time.